The first thing you notice is the silence. Not the roar of the crowd, not the whistle of the referee, not the crunch of leather against bone. The silence, because silence in football is unnatural. The game is supposed to be chaos. The pounding of cleats on turf, the crash of bodies. The guttural yells of men giving everything they have on every down. But when silence comes, it arrives like a curtain falling over the stage. It means something has gone terribly wrong. I've seen it in the stories of the 1930s, buried in yellowed newspapers and fading archives. A player goes down, the crowd gasps, and then there is nothing but the eerie weight of stillness. The coaches rush onto the field. Teammates stand frozen, helmets in their hands, unsure whether to pray or to turn away. And sometimes the man on the ground never gets up. This was the reality of football's deadliest decade. The 1930s did not just shape the NFL into the league we know today. They nearly destroyed it. They forced the sport to reckon with a truth it could no longer outrun. That football was not merely a test of toughness, but a game that could kill. Think about what it meant to strap on a helmet in 1933. That helmet was little more than a piece of hardened leather, stitched together like a saddle, with no face mask, no padding, no real protection. It was a token, a gesture, more than a shield. When players collided headfirst, the leather gave no more comfort than a second layer of skin. Bones cracked, skulls fractured, and still the league pressed forward. In 1931, Columbia University's Dr. Augustus Thorndike published a warning about the mounting injuries in college and professional football. He called it a public danger, and he wasn't exaggerating. Spinal injuries were reported with frightening frequency. Players left the field paralyzed. Families grieved over sons who had died in what was still called, with pride, the manliest of American games. Newspapers ran obituaries for men barely in their 20s. Their causes of death listed simply as football injury. But this was the 1930s, the era of the Great Depression. The country was desperate for heroes, desperate for escapes. So men played anyway. They played because $5 a game could mean food on the table for a family. They played because the crowds needed someone to cheer for. They played because the league, fragile and still fighting for survival, demanded that the show go on. And so the game became a crucible of risk. Every hit was heavier than the last. Rosters were thin, so players never came off the field. They played 60 minutes, offense and defense, through mud, ice, and pain that today would sideline a star for weeks. There were no doctors patrolling the sidelines with blue tents and concussion protocols. If you could stand, you could play. If you could breathe, you were told to get back in the game. I think about the men who never made it home, the forgotten names. Like Jack Torrance, an All-American tackle whose career ended not in glory, but in tragedy. Or Frosty Peters, a kicker and quarterback who was carried off the field more times than he could count. Each hit pushing his body closer to collapse. Their names aren't remembered alongside legends like Bronco Nagurski or Don Hudson. But they are part of the story. The shadow side of the 1930s NFL, the cost the game exacted from its players. It is easy, in hindsight, to glorify the toughness of that decade. To romanticize it as the era when men were made of iron and pain was simply part of the job. But beneath that mythology was a much darker truth. The 1930s were not just about toughness, they were about survival. Consider the numbers. By 1931, at least 18 football-related deaths were reported in a single season across the country. Dozens more suffered crippling injuries that ended not just careers, but lives as they once knew them. The medical community began to question whether the sport could continue in its current form. And for the first time, whispers emerged about whether football was worth the price. But the league was stubborn. It had been born from the smoke-filled backrooms of Canton, Ohio in 1920, and it would not bow to critics now. Instead, it doubled down. Owners insisted that danger was part of the appeal. Fans came because they wanted violence. They wanted to see men collide with reckless abandon, to live vicariously through the brutality of the field. As one journalist wrote in 1934, "Football is America's gladiatorial contest, and the public thirsts for its blood." Yet even as the league tried to push forward, the cracks began to show. Lawsuits appeared. Colleges debated banning the game outright. And in living rooms across America, parents quietly asked themselves whether they could stomach sending their sons into a sport that seemed more like a battlefield than a pastime. The decade unfolded like a test of wills. For every new hero who rose, Nagurski barreling through defenses, Hudson redefining the receiver position, there was a casualty in the shadows. A man carried off the field, his career over before it began. A spinal cord snapped in a routine pileup, the concussion ignored until the mind began to slip away. That's the haunting paradox of the 1930s. It was the decade that gave the NFL its legends, its rivalries, its national stage. But it was also the decade that demanded blood for every inch of progress. And so, I return to the silence. Because that silence was the cost of the game. Every time a stadium went still, every time players dropped to one knee in prayer, the sport was reminded of what it truly was. Not just a test of skill, not just a spectacle of athleticism, but a gamble with life itself. When we look back at the 1930s, we see more than grainy black and white footage of leather helmets and mud-soaked jerseys. We see a crucible where football nearly consumed itself. We see the decade that forced the league to decide, evolve, or perish. This documentary is not about the highlight reels. It is about the shadows beneath them. It is about the men who sacrificed more than glory, more than statistics, more than championships. It is about the decade when football teetered on the edge of oblivion, and only through blood and silence did it survive. The 1930s were not just football's deadliest decade. They were the years that proved football's power and its peril. And so we begin where every story of that decade begins, with the silence after the roar, the final season that left a player forever changed, and the haunting question that still lingers today: how much is the game worth when the cost is a man's life? The 1930s were not just another decade of football. They were the crucible in which the sport was tested, reshaped, and nearly broken. When we talk about the National Football League today, we speak of billion-dollar stadiums, instant replay, concussion protocols, and global audiences. But to understand how the league got here, you must step back to a time when all of those things were unthinkable, when football itself was clinging to survival. This was a country battered by the Great Depression. Unemployment rates soared to nearly 25%. Breadlines stretched 4 blocks in the industrial cities of the Midwest. Families clutched at pennies, scraping together what little they had to endure the long winters. Yet, even in the bleakness of that era, Americans craved spectacle. They craved distraction. And they found it, in part, on the football field. But football in the 1930s was unlike the polished product we see now. The NFL was still a fledgling experiment, a league constantly teetering on the edge of collapse. Teams came and went with alarming frequency. The Portsmouth Spartans became the Detroit Lions. The Staten Island Stapletons disappeared. The Duluth Eskimos faded into memory. Travel was brutal, profits thin, and survival uncertain. Players took home scraps compared to today's stars, often working second jobs just to stay afloat. And yet, amid the instability, the 1930s were the decade that defined professional football. Because this was the decade when the league faced its greatest test. The question of whether the game could survive its own violence. The brutality of the sport was not a hidden secret. It was written across the faces of players who returned home battered and broken. Doctors sounded alarms with increasing urgency. In 1931, at least 18 young men died from football injuries across college and professional levels. For a league with only a handful of franchises, that number was staggering. And while colleges wrestled with the ethics of continuing such a dangerous game, The NFL leaned into the violence as its calling card. To fans, football's danger was part of the attraction. Newspapers of the era didn't shy away from it. T celebrated it. One 1934 article in the Chicago Tribune declared, "Football is the roughest and the toughest, and that is why the crowds come." This was not basketball with its finesse, nor baseball with its deliberate pace. This was a game of collision, a game that mirrored the hardships of the Depression itself, merciless, unforgiving, a test of endurance. But the spectacle came at a price. Careers were short, often no longer than a handful of seasons. There was no union, no pension, no promise of long-term security. A player injured on Sunday might find himself unemployed by Tuesday. Men like Bronco Nagurski became legends precisely because they endured what so many others could not. Nagurski, the bruising fullback of the Chicago Bears, was mythologized for his ability to plow through defenders as if they were paper. But behind that mythology was a body that absorbed punishment beyond comprehension. The decade was not only brutal, it was transformative. Rules were changing, often in direct response to the rising toll of injuries. The forward pass, once considered gimmicky, began to evolve into a more central part of the game, opening space on the field and reducing slightly the constant head-on collisions. In 1933, the NFL split from college football by introducing its own rulebook, designed to encourage more scoring and excitement. That same year saw the first official championship game, a clash between the Chicago Bears and the New York Giants at Wrigley Field. It was a turning point. That championship wasn't just about crowning a winner. It was about legitimacy. It gave the NFL something to sell, something to market, something to build upon. And yet, even as the league reached for the spotlight, the shadows of its violence remained impossible to ignore. For every celebrated game, there was a headline about tragedy. A fractured vertebra. A player carried off on a stretcher. A career ended before it truly began. Doctors coined the term football paralysis to describe the wave of spinal injuries they were seeing. Newspapers debated whether the sport should be outlawed. And hovering over all of this was the simple truth. The 1930s were football's deadliest decade. It was the decade when the sport's survival hinged not just on fans and finances, but on whether society would tolerate its human cost. The NFL responded with a mixture of denial and slow reform. Helmets became more common, though still made of leather and offering little protection. Some teams experimented with plastic prototypes, but they were brittle and unreliable. Coaches began teaching safer tackling techniques, though the concept of player safety as we know it today was still decades away. The league's leaders walked a fine line, acknowledging the danger too openly might drive parents and players away, but ignoring it entirely risked public backlash. It is here, in this tension, that the 1930s revealed their true significance. Because what we see in this decade is not just the brutality of the sport, but its resilience. For every man who fell, another stepped forward. For every doctor who warned against the game, there were thousands of fans packing into stadiums demanding more. For every question about football's future, there was an answer written in blood and mud. The game would go on. And so, the 1930s gave us more than just legends and lore. They gave us the framework of the modern NFL. They forced the league to evolve its rules, its identity, and its place in American culture. They solidified football not just as a pastime, but as a mirror of the nation's own struggles. In a decade defined by hardship, football became both escape and expression, a brutal dance that reflected the endurance of the American spirit. But at what cost? That question lingers over every story from the decade. At what cost did the NFL earn its legitimacy? At what cost did the game cement its future? For every touchdown scored, there was a man who never played again. For every championship won, there was a family left grieving. This is the story of the NFL's deadliest decade. It is a story of men who played not for riches, not for fame, but for survival. It is a story of a league that walked the razor's edge between glory and disaster. It is a story of how football, in all its violence and all its triumph, was forged in the fires of the 1930s. Over the next chapters, we will walk through that decade in all its complexity. We will hear the stories of the men who defined it, the legends who built the game, and the forgotten players who paid its price. We will examine the innovations, the controversies, and the tragedies that shaped the NFL's future. Because to understand football today, must first understand the silence that haunted the fields of the 1930s. You must understand the bodies left behind, the questions that refused to go away, and the decisions that would echo for generations. This is not a story of highlights. It is a story of shadows, and it begins now. The year was 1931, and the country was drowning in despair. The stock market had collapsed 2 years earlier, and the Great Depression had sunk its claws deep into every American town and city. In those days, football wasn't the polished spectacle of television contracts or endorsement deals. It was raw, unforgiving, and barely holding on. And nowhere was this more apparent than in the story of a team called the Portsmouth Spartans. Portsmouth was a small industrial town in Ohio, clinging to the banks of the Ohio River. It wasn't Chicago, it wasn't New York, it wasn't even Cleveland. It was a working-class place, built on steel and grit. Yet, somehow, in the middle of America's worst economic crisis, Portsmouth fielded one of the toughest football teams the country had ever seen. The Spartans were not glamorous. They didn't have the resources of big city franchises. Their stadium held only a few thousand people, most of whom paid in coins scraped together from factory wages. Players earned so little that many lived in boarding houses or slept in rented rooms. They played for survival as much as pride, their bodies serving as currency in a game that demanded sacrifice. And yet, the Spartans mattered. They mattered because they embodied what football in the 1930s was all about: resilience in the face of hardship, toughness in the face of pain. When they took the field against the league's giants, they carried with them the weight of their entire town, a community battered by economic collapse but unwilling to bow. In 1932, the Spartans played one of the most important games in NFL history. It wasn't billed as such at the time, but looking back, it became a turning point for the league. The Chicago Bears and Portsmouth Spartans finished the season tied for first place. The NFL had no system in place to decide a champion. There were no playoffs, no tiebreakers, no structured postseason. But with fans clamoring for a conclusion, the league improvised. It scheduled an extra game between the two teams to decide who would be crowned champions. That game, played on December 18, 1932, inside Chicago Stadium, became legendary. The conditions were brutal. Outside, a blizzard raged. The field at Wrigley was covered in snow and ice, making it unplayable. So, in desperation, the game was moved indoors to the arena normally used for hockey and horse shows. The field was only 80 yards long, the end zones were shortened, and the air inside was thick with smoke from the crowd. What unfolded was less a football game than a battle of attrition. Players slipped on the concrete beneath a thin layer of dirt. The shortened field forced constant collisions. It was violent, chaotic, and strangely mesmerizing. The Bears won 9-0, but the true winner that night was the league itself. Because in improvising that championship, the NFL stumbled onto an idea that would transform its future. The concept of a postseason, a final game to decide who truly stood on top. But hidden beneath that moment of progress was the darker truth. The Spartans, for all their toughness and grit, were finished. Portsmouth simply could not sustain a professional football team during the Depression. The franchise was sold, relocated, and reborn as the Detroit Lions in 1934. For the people of Portsmouth, it was another loss in a decade defined by losses. For the players, it was a reminder that professional football was as unstable as their paychecks. Yet the story of the Spartans lingers because it reveals the heart of the 1930s. NFL. The men who played then were not shielded by money or fame. They were exposed to every risk, every injury, every brutal hit, with little more than pride to protect them. The league was a patchwork of survival. Teams folding and reforming, players coming and going like shadows, and always, the violence lingered. Bronko Nagurski, the Bears' indomitable fullback, was a central figure of that era. His legend was born in games like that 1932 championship. Nagurski was so powerful that defenders swore tackling him was like being hit by a truck. One opponent described the sensation as colliding with a steel beam wrapped in flesh. But even Nagurski, for all his mythic toughness, was a man made vulnerable by the very game that made him famous. He played through injuries that today would end careers. Broken ribs, concussions, torn ligaments. They were considered minor inconveniences in an age that demanded players return to the field no matter the cost. The truth is, football in the 1930s left scars, both visible and invisible. Players endured not only the bone-rattling collisions, but also the psychological toll of knowing that every play could be their last. There was no guarantee of medical care, no long-term security. Men lived with the knowledge that their bodies were disposable, and the league treated them as such. And yet, the public demanded more. The Great Depression had hardened people. They wanted heroes who reflected their own struggles, men who refused to break even when the world seemed determined to crush them. Football delivered those heroes, but at a devastating price. Take the case of a player like Dutch Clark, the quarterback of the Spartans and later the Lions. Clark was one of the first great field generals, a man whose intelligence and leadership elevated his team beyond its limitations. But for every touchdown pass or dazzling run, there was also punishment. Clark's body absorbed the blows of defenders, eager to erase his brilliance. By the time his career ended, he, like so many others, carried injuries that would never fully heal. The paradox of the 1930s NFL is captured in men like Clark and Nagurski. Their greatness inspired the growth of the league, but their suffering highlighted the dangers that threatened its very existence. It was a decade defined by dualities, triumph and tragedy, progress and peril, survival and sacrifice. The creation of the championship game, born from that icy clash in 1932, marked the start of the NFL's transformation into a true national spectacle. But even as the league gained legitimacy, the whispers of danger never stopped. Every game carried with it the potential for silence, the stillness of a man not rising from the turf. The public thrilled at the violence, but recoiled at its consequences. It was a balancing act the NFL would wrestle with for the rest of its history. Looking back at the Spartans, I see more than just a team lost to time. I see the embodiment of the 1930s NFL small-town grit, fleeting survival, and ultimate sacrifice. They fought their way into history, only to vanish when the economics of the Depression swallowed them whole. Their story reminds us that football in that decade was never guaranteed. Every team, every player, every game was perched on the edge of disappearance. And that is what makes the 1930s so haunting. It was the decade when the NFL could have died. It was the decade when tragedy loomed as large as triumph. When the game's future was written not only in championships, but in injuries, obituaries, and silence. The Portsmouth Spartans may be gone, but their legacy endures. They were part of the fragile foundation upon which the modern NFL was built. They remind us that for every success story of the league, there were towns left behind, players broken, and lives forever altered. The NFL's rise in the 1930s came at a cost measured not in dollars, but in bodies. And that is the truth we must confront as we move deeper into this story, that the league, survival, was paid for by men who had little to give except everything. The air in the stadium that day was sharp and cold, the kind of winter chill that stung the skin and made every breath feel heavier. It was late in the 1930s, a decade that had already taken its share of men from the game. The crowd roared, restless and unrestrained as two teams lined up in brutal silence, preparing for the snap. The center bent over, the ball pressed against frozen turf. The quarterback's voice cut through the haze, commanding the moment, and then impact. One play later, the crowd would fall silent. A running back, low to the ground, met a defender head-on. No helmets with face masks, no mouthguards. Just flesh, bone, and leather colliding at full speed. The crack that echoed was not the kind that thrills a crowd, was the sound of something breaking. When the pile untangled, the young man lay motionless, staring blankly into the gray sky above. Trainers rushed in. His teammates surrounded him. And in that instant, the joyous chaos of football vanished into an almost sacred stillness. It wasn't the first time it had happened, and it wouldn't be the last. The 1930s was a decade of collisions on the field, in society, in the very soul of the game. Football was violent by design, and brutal by necessity. The equipment was primitive. The medical understanding was nearly non-existent. But what made the decade infamous wasn't just the number of injuries, it was the sheer volume of lives permanently altered, and the public reckoning that followed. Doctors at the time began to speak openly about football paralysis. It wasn't an exaggeration. Headlines in newspapers from coast to coast carried stories of high school, college, and professional players suffering fractured spines, crushed skulls, or concussions so severe they never truly recovered. Between 1931 and 1937, newspapers reported dozens of deaths linked directly to football at all levels of play. Some seasons saw more than 20 young men perish. Most of those fatalities never touched the professional ranks, but the shadow they cast fell across the NFL. If parents buried sons who died for a game, what did that mean for a league trying to sell football as entertainment? The league's leadership was uneasy, but at the time, injuries were considered part of the bargain. The players themselves often accepted it. Pain was a badge of honor. If you limped, you taped it. If you bled, you wiped it away. If you were concussed, you shook it off. Those phrases weren't marketing slogans, they were survival strategies. The game demanded nothing less. The irony of the 1930s is that even as the NFL fought for legitimacy, it had to confront a truth it couldn't easily admit. The violence that drew people in was the same violence that threatened to undo it. Fans cheered the collisions, the raw spectacle of bodies crashing against each other. Yet the headlines told a different story. A Chicago Tribune piece from 1933 documented the swelling number of football injuries nationwide, noting with alarm that the cumulative toll resembled a season of warfare. Other outlets compared the death rate of football to the front lines of battle, a chilling echo of a country that still carried the scars of World War I. Medical professionals began to take notice. Orthopedic surgeons, neurologists, and family doctors alike began speaking publicly about the dangers. Concussions, though poorly understood, were recognized as serious even if players ignored the symptoms. Spinal cord injuries often left young men paralyzed for life, their futures erased in an instant. The phrase football casualties entered the American vocabulary. And with it, the growing question, was the sport too dangerous to survive? Inside locker rooms, however, the culture was unflinching. A coach's reputation was built not only on wins and losses, but on how tough his men played. Shake it off wasn't just encouragement, it was an order. To admit weakness was to risk your place on the team, or worse, your dignity in front of your peers. For working-class men in the 1930s, the stakes were even higher. The Great Depression had stripped away job security and hope for millions. For some, football was one of the only lifelines to a paycheck, however small, and the possibility of a better life. To walk away because of injury was unthinkable. That mindset hardened the culture of the NFL, but it also deepened its crisis. The league could not escape the fact that it was selling brutality. Fans might cheer a crushing tackle, but they recoiled when the stretcher came out. Owners worried about liability, players worried about survival, and doctors worried about the game's future. Public sentiment swayed back and forth. On one hand, football was becoming a symbol of American grit, celebrated for its toughness and its ability to reflect the hard realities of the Depression era. On the other hand, mothers and fathers across the nation were burying sons. Local school boards debated banning the sport altogether. College trustees questioned whether the risk was worth the prestige. And every time another headline declared a player dead from football injuries, the question of survival grew louder. The NFL, still young and fragile, had no easy answers. Protective equipment was slowly improving, but change came at a glacial pace. Helmets were optional until the mid-1930s, and even then, the thin leather caps offered little more than psychological comfort. Pads were minimal. Medical staffs were sparse, often just a trainer with basic first aid knowledge. The science of brain trauma was decades away from serious understanding. And yet, despite everything, the broken bones, the paralysis, the funerals, the players kept coming. That, perhaps, was the most haunting part of all. They lined up, game after game, season after season, knowing that every snap was a gamble with their future, not because they were reckless, but because the game demanded it. Football was not a pastime in the 1930s, was a proving ground. And to prove oneself meant risking everything. This paradox, the attraction and the destruction, defined the decade. Football could not live without violence, but it might not live with it either. Each headline chipped away at its credibility. Each stretcher raised questions in the stands. The NFL was no longer simply fighting for fans. It was fighting for its right to exist. Archival pause. The silent image of a player carried from the field, his teammates staring blankly, the crowd murmuring with unease. The 1930s forced football to confront its deadliest reality, that the game itself might kill its future. And as the league trudged deeper into the decade, the question lingered: could the NFL evolve quickly enough to survive its own brutality? By the mid-1930s, the National Football League found itself staring at a crossroads. The roar of the crowd still filled the autumn air, but behind closed doors, there was an unease that even the loudest cheers could not drown out. Football was under siege not just by rival sports or by its financial instability in the shadows of the Great Depression, but by the growing chorus of voices calling it too dangerous to survive. The evidence was everywhere. Newspapers published gruesome tallies at the end of each season, lists of boys and men who had lost their lives to the game. Colleges debated whether football had a place on campus. Some high schools banned it outright. The image of players lying unconscious or paralyzed on the field was becoming too familiar, too unsettling to be dismissed as mere misfortune. Football's brutality, once a badge of honor, was threatening to brand it as barbarism. The NFL could not afford that. In 1930, the league was not yet the empire we know today. It was fragile, almost experimentally small collection of franchises. Many of them financially shaky, all competing for relevance in a country dominated by baseball and boxing. If public opinion turned against football, the league might not survive. Something had to change. That something came in the form of reform. The decade became an era of tinkering, of desperate adjustments designed not only to improve the spectacle of the game, but to preserve its very existence. League officials, coaches, and even medical voices began pushing for new rules that would soften the sharpest edges of the sport. It was less about protecting individual players, though. That was the effect, and more about protecting the game itself. One of the most significant reforms was the gradual reshaping of tackling and blocking rules. In the early years, linemen could use nearly any means necessary to bulldoze their opponents. Head-to-head collisions were not just common, they were encouraged. By the mid-1930s, the NFL began cracking down on flying wedges and mass momentum plays that had once defined the sport but left carnage in their wake. These formations, where players locked arms and hurled themselves at defenders like a human battering ram, were spectacular and deadly. Eliminating them was a survival strategy. But reforms did not stop there. The forward pass, which had been legalized back in 1906 after a spate of football deaths, finally began to find a place in the NFL strategy during the 1930s. Passing opened the field, reducing the endless grind of body-and-body collisions at the line of scrimmage. It introduced speed, finesse, and creativity into a sport that had long been dominated by brute force. Fans loved it, players adapted to it, and slowly, football began to look less like trench warfare and more like the modern game. The introduction of hash marks in 1933 may seem trivial to the untrained eye, but it was revolutionary. Before hash marks, the ball could be placed near the sideline after a play ended there, limiting offensive options and forcing players into predictable, collision-heavy runs. With hash marks bringing the ball closer to the center of the field, offenses suddenly had room to maneuver, room to design plays that avoided the constant head-on crashes that defined earlier decades. It was a subtle shift, but a crucial one in reducing injuries and expanding the spectacle. Another reform came in 1934, when the NFL outlawed the dangerous hip tackle that involved dragging down a runner by the neck or head from behind, method that often resulted in severe spinal or head trauma. Coaches resisted at first, claiming it softened the game. But by then, the pressure from medical communities and outraged parents was too strong to ignore. And yet, for all the reforms, the violence did not vanish. It couldn't. Football's DNA was still rooted in collision, still shaped by the primal act of one man trying to impose his will physically on another. Rules could redirect that energy, but they could not erase it. In truth, the changes were less about protecting players than about controlling the narrative, convincing the public that football was evolving, that it was no longer the reckless blood sport critics claimed. The game's evolution also required equipment to catch up, however slowly. Helmets, once optional, became more common as the decade progressed. But they were little more than leather caps, offering minimal protection. The padding inside was laughably thin by modern standards, unable to absorb the force of high-speed collisions. Players still suffered concussions at alarming rates, but at least they looked protected, and sometimes appearance mattered as much as function. The reforms gave football something priceless: time. Time to develop a style of play that was both thrilling and survivable. Time to keep mothers from pulling their sons off teams. Time to persuade skeptical universities to maintain their programs. The NFL didn't just need players, needed the public's permission to exist. The changes of the 1930s kept that permission alive. Yet there was always tension in the air. Every rule adjustment sparked debate. Purists insisted the game was being softened beyond recognition. Coaches grumbled about losing tactical advantages. Players, caught in the middle, bore the brunt of both the old brutality and the new expectations. They still risked their lives on every play, even as the league boasted about reforms. Consider the contradiction. In 1936, the NFL celebrated the successful implementation of hash marks, claiming they had opened up the game and made it safer. That same year, reports circulated of dozens of catastrophic injuries at the college and professional levels. For every headline praising reform, there was another reminding the public of the cost. It was an uneasy balancing act, and the league knew it. But reform was not just about safety, it was about identity. The NFL of the 1930s was trying to define itself, to distinguish its product from college football, which still drew larger crowds and greater prestige. The pro game needed to be seen as both entertaining and respectable. Every new rule served a dual purpose: to reassure the public of safety, while enhancing the uniqueness of the professional spectacle. The truth is, reform saved football, but it did not heal it. The violence never truly left. It simply changed shape. Instead of mass momentum plays, there were now open-field collisions. Instead of wedge formations, there were high-speed tackles on passing routes. Instead of spinal fractures from head-on scrums, there were concussions from defenders sprinting full speed into receivers. the 1930s had not eliminated danger. It had redefined it. Looking back, the reforms of the 1930s were not just about adjusting rules. They were about teaching football to survive itself. Without them, the sport might have faded into obscurity, remembered only as a reckless experiment, too lethal to last. With them, the NFL bought enough credibility to inch toward the future, to begin the slow climb toward the juggernaut it would one day become. But every step forward was haunted by a question. How much change could football endure before it lost the essence that made it beloved? That was the paradox the 1930s left behind. Reform had saved the game, but at what cost to its soul? They called them players, but in the 1930s, they were closer to gladiators, men who stepped into the arena, not for riches, not for glory, but for survival. Football was not yet a path to wealth or celebrity. It was a lifeline, however fragile, in a decade defined by poverty, unemployment, and hunger. To understand the NFL in the 1930s, you have to understand the men who risked everything to play it. These were not household names, not in the way we think of stars today. The vast majority of players earned less than the average factory worker, often just a few dollars per game. Some played on Sunday afternoons and returned to coal mines, steel mills, or farms on Monday morning. Their bodies were battered, their paychecks meager, their futures uncertain. Yet they played because football offered something that the Depression stole from so many. Dignity? Take Bronco Nagurski, the Chicago Bears' indestructible fullback and lineman. A man whose very name seemed carved from stone. Nagurski grew up on a farm in International Falls, Minnesota, plowing fields by hand, hauling logs through frozen forests. His strength was not sculpted in gymsit, was born of necessity, hardened by the labor of survival. On the field, he became a legend for his ability to run through defenders as if they were paper walls. It usually takes more than one man to stop Bronco, a sportswriter once quipped. And sometimes more than an entire team. But even Nagurski was not immune to the grind. He broke bones, tore muscles, absorbed punishment that would end modern careers. Yet he played on, because playing football, even through agony, was better than surrendering to the anonymity of Depression-era hardship. For him and countless others, football was both escape and identity. The NFL of the 1930s was filled with men like Nagurski. Men whose backgrounds reflected the struggles of the nation itself. Mel Ang, the indomitable center of the New York Giants, worked tirelessly, both on and off the field, holding down off-season jobs to make ends meet. Cliff Battles, one of the league's early rushing stars, earned just $175 per game with the Boston Redskins, a sum that vanished quickly in a decade when breadlines still wrapped around city blocks. For every paycheck, they endured broken ribs, shattered noses, and the creeping knowledge that one play could end their livelihood forever. Yet the culture of the game did not allow for weakness. Injuries were hidden, pain was silenced. A player who admitted to being hurt risked losing his spot, his income, his fragile foothold in the league. Coaches demanded stoicism, teammates expected it, and society celebrated it. The mythology of the Ironman player, the one who played both ways for 60 minutes without complaint, was not just a romantic idea. It was the expectation. Consider the story of Ernie Nevers, a legend whose career straddled the 1920s and early 1930s. Nevers once scored all 40 points for the Chicago Cardinals in a single game, a record that still stands. But behind the heroics lay a man who endured injuries that would cripple most athletes. Broken bones, concussions, endless bruises. Nevers carried them like invisible scars. He once confessed that he played through such relentless pain that he had to soak his body in hot baths for hours just to be able to sleep. Yet to the public, he was celebrated as the very embodiment of toughness. That ethos of endurance reflected the times. The Great Depression had stripped millions of Americans of security, forcing them into daily battles for survival. Football players became symbolic extensions of that struggle-working men who refused to quit, no matter how punishing the circumstances. When fans watched Nagurski plow through tacklers, or N grind out 60 minutes in the trenches, they saw a reflection of themselves. Football became more than a game. It became a metaphor for resilience in an unforgiving world. But there was a darker side to that resilience. Medical science in the 1930s was only beginning to scratch the surface of what repeated trauma could do to the human body, especially the brain. Players spoke of getting their bell rung as if it were nothing, a temporary fog quickly dismissed. In reality, those repeated blows left invisible damage, lingering headaches, blurred vision, memory lapses. But no one connected the dots, not the doctors, not the players themselves. To be tough was to endure. To admit otherwise was unthinkable. Financial desperation compounded the risks. Many players had no contracts beyond a single season. If they sat out injured, their pay stopped. If they complained too loudly, they were cut. Some turned to painkillers or alcohol to numb the punishment, trading long-term health for short-term survival. Others simply played until their bodies gave out, leaving the league with nothing to fall back on. There were no pensions, no safety nets, no medical coverage once the cheers stopped. For fans, these realities were invisible. What they saw was the spectacle, the mud, the collisions, the raw courage of men who seemed larger than life. Newspapers celebrated their exploits, turning players into local heroes even as they struggled privately. The mythology of the indestructible football man became part of American folklore, masking the vulnerability beneath. And yet, within that vulnerability lay the very heart of the NFL's appeal. The 1930s were not an era of millionaires or endorsements. They were not an age of celebrity quarterbacks with national followings. They were a time when the league's survival depended on ordinary men doing extraordinary things. Laborers, farmers, factory workers, who strapped on leather helmets and stepped into violence because it offered them a chance, however fleeting, at something greater than themselves. It is easy to romanticize those players now, to remember Nagurski's bulldozing runs or Nevers's scoring feats. But to do so without acknowledging the price they paid would be dishonest. Every heroic performance came with hidden costs. The bones that never healed properly. The minds clouded by repeated concussions. The lives cut short long after the crowds had stopped cheering. They were pioneers, yes, but pioneers who paid in blood for the league's survival. In the end, the players of the 1930s were not just athletes. They were the embodiment of a nation's struggle, resilient, battered, determined to keep moving forward. Their stories remind us that football's growth was never inevitable. It was purchased by the sacrifice of men who risked everything for a game that, at the time, gave little back. And so, when we speak of the NFL's rise, we must remember them. Not as faceless figures lost to history, but as flesh-hand-blood men who carried the weight of both the game and the times. The Depression tested America's resilience. Football tested theirs. Rivalry. It is the lifeblood of sport. The current that transforms a contest into a saga, a game into a war. And in the 1930s, no rivalry captured the spirit of the NFL's deadliest decade more than the brutal, bone-crunching clashes between the Chicago Bears and the Green Bay Packers. To speak of that rivalry is to speak of survival itself, for these encounters were less about touchdowns and more about proving who could endure the most punishment without breaking. The backdrop was perfect for conflict. Chicago and Green Bay were separated by less than 200 miles, two Midwestern outposts connected by geography but divided by identity. Chicago was a sprawling industrial giant, a city of steel, grit, and ambition. Green Bay was a small-town community, barely large enough to justify a professional franchise, clinging to football as its one great claim to national relevance. When these two teams met, they carried more than helmets and pads onto the field. They carried civic pride, economic frustration, and the raw determination of men who knew their town's honor was on the line. The coaches themselves embodied the rivalry's intensity. George Halas, Papa Bear, ruled the Chicago Bears with a stern hand and a militaristic sense of order. He demanded discipline, toughness, and execution. Curly Lambeau, the founder and coach of the Green Bay Packers, was his opposite in style, but equal in drive, charismatic, bold, and fiercely protective of his small-town dynasty. Their clashes on the sidelines mirrored the battles on the field. Two titans shaping not just their teams, but the very character of the NFL. The Bears-Packers games of the 1930s were spectacles of violence. Leather helmets cracked against each other like splitting wood. Tackles were not mere takedowns. They were collisions meant to break a man's will. Players emerged bloodied, bruised, and sometimes unconscious. Yet the game pressed on. The rivalry was not just about winning, it was about sending a message. To lose was to surrender your toughness, and in the 1930s NFL, toughness was everything. Bronco Nagurski, Chicago's unstoppable force, often stood at the center of these clashes. His running style was not elegant, not evasive. He lowered his shoulders and plowed straight through defenders, daring anyone to stand in his way. Packers linemen who tried to stop him often found themselves flattened, as though hit by a runaway train. Sports writers of the time compared Nagurski's runs to natural disasters, inevitable, overwhelming, and devastating. To tackle him was to risk injury. Yet the Packers rose to the challenge again and again. Fueled by the knowledge that stopping Nagurski meant more than preventing a touchdown, it meant protecting Green Bay's pride. On the other side, the Packers had their own legends. Don Hutson, who joined the team in 1935, revolutionized the passing game with his speed and precision, stretching defenses in ways they had never seen before. Hutson was the antithesis of Nagurski. Where Bronco embodied brute force, Hutson embodied finesse. His presence gave the Packers a weapon that balanced the brutality of their battles with Chicago, proving that artistry could exist alongside carnage. But even Hutson, dazzling as he was, could not escape the physical toll. Defensive backs hammered him on every route, intent on making him pay for every yard he gained. The rivalry produced moments that bordered on myth. In 1934, the Bears marched into Green Bay for a game that would live in infamy. The field was a mud-soaked pit, the kind of surface that turned every play into a struggle for footing. Players slipped, skidded, and slammed into each other with reckless abandon. Nagurski bulldozed through defenders, while Packers linemen retaliated with hits that echoed across the stands. By the final whistle, the scoreboard barely mattered. What mattered was that both teams had survived, battered but unbroken. The papers called it one of the most savage games ever played. Violence was not just tolerated in these matchups, it was celebrated. Fans came to see the brutality, to witness the spectacle of men pushed to their limits. In a decade when life itself felt like a fight, these games resonated deeply. They mirrored the struggles of the Depression, the sense that survival required both courage and sacrifice. Watching the Bears and Packers clash was like watching America's own struggle played out on a muddy gridiron. But the rivalry was not without consequences. Injuries piled up, careers shortened, bodies were broken. Players spoke of games against their rival with a mix of dread and pride, knowing that nothing tested them more. A victory meant more than points in the standings. It was a validation of their toughness, a confirmation that they belonged in the league's unforgiving world. A loss, meanwhile, was not just defeat. It was humiliation. The Packers, despite their small-town roots, often had the upper hand in the 1930s. Lambeau's teams captured 3 straight championships from 1929 to 1931, establishing Green Bay as a dynasty in an era when dynasties seemed impossible. The Bears countered with championships of their own, including the legendary 1932 and 1933 seasons that helped define the NFL's legitimacy. Each title, each victory, added fuel to the rivalry, ensuring that every clash carried the weight of history. The ferocity of these games also forced the NFL to confront its own identity. Could the league survive if its defining rivalry was also its most violent? The Bears and Packers embodied everything thrilling about football, but also everything dangerous. Every time a player was carted off, every time a headline highlighted the brutality, the league's reputation teetered. Yet paradoxically, it was this very rivalry that kept fans engaged, that gave the league its early aura of legitimacy. Without the Bears and Packers, the NFL might not have survived the 1930s. To this day, the Bears-Packers rivalry remains the oldest and most storied in NFL history. But its roots in the 1930s reveal something deeper. It was not just about two teams. It was about proving the game itself could endure. Each violent clash was a gamble, a test of whether football's appeal could outweigh its dangers. That the NFL emerged stronger speaks to the magnetic power of rivalry, and to the men who gave everything to sustain it. The 1930s Bears and Packers did more than win games. They carved the NFL's identity into the American consciousness, shaping a league that learned to thrive on conflict, to sell violence as spectacle, and to transform survival into entertainment. Their battles were not clean, not safe, and not for the faint of heart, but they were unforgettable. And so, when we look back on the decade that nearly killed football, we must remember this. It was the rivalry that saved it. I remember the silences most of all. Not the roar of the crowd, not the crunch of pads, not the shrill of a referee's whistle, but the silences that followed when a player lay still on the grass and everyone, for just a moment, wondered if he would ever rise again. In the 1930s, those silences weren't just pauses in a game. They were the echoes of a truth the league didn't yet have the courage to face. Players weren't merely risking a bad hit or a twisted knee. They were mortgaging their bodies, their futures, and often their very minds. The medical science of that era was woefully behind the brutality of the sport. Doctors on the sidelines were often little more than well-meaning men with ice packs and bandages, armed with little knowledge of head trauma, internal bleeding, or long-term joint damage. What we now call concussions were dismissed with a word that feels almost cruel in hindsight: getting your bell rung. Trainers would hold up fingers, shine a flashlight, maybe wave some smelling salts beneath a dazed player's nose. And if that man could stumble back to the huddle, he was told to shake it off. His pain was not injury, it was duty. But the toll was staggering. Consider Glenn "Pop" Warner, not as a player, but as a coach. In the early 1930s, Warner warned reporters that too many men were leaving the field never the same again. He spoke of players forgetting plays minutes after being hit, of blank stares on the bench that lasted entire quarters. Warner had coached legends and understood toughness better than anyone, but even he admitted the game was extracting something that no man could give back. His words were brushed aside. After all, America in the Depression had little patience for men who complained about pain. Football was supposed to harden you, not hollow you. The culture of the time glorified resilience above all. If a man couldn't take a beating and keep playing, the whispers began. Maybe he wasn't cut out for football. Maybe he wasn't cut out for life. Sports writers fed into this narrative. They wrote columns mocking players who lingered on the ground too long or couldn't answer the bell. The very language of the era framed suffering as weakness, and weakness as a sin. A player who dared admit he felt different after a blow to the head might as well have admitted he didn't belong in the league. And yet, beneath the bravado, the medical wreckage was piling up. By the late 1930s, physicians outside football circles began publishing papers warning that repeated head injuries could have permanent effects. One 1937 article in the Journal of the American Medical Association used the phrase traumatic encephalopathy to describe the changes seen in boxers who had endured years of blows to the skull. They called it punch-drunk syndrome, noting symptoms like slurred speech, memory lapses, and emotional instability. Football, though not yet studied formally, was already producing its own casualties that mirrored those findings. Take the story of Ernie Nevers, one of the great Ironmen of the era. Nevers was revered for playing both ways, carrying the ball, punting, tackling, and even coaching at times. But his body bore scars invisible to the adoring fans. Nevers endured countless hits that left him staggering, concussed, or with broken bones that never healed properly. After retiring, he admitted he could no longer sleep through the night without pain. His joints ached constantly. His memory faltered. He was celebrated as a hero, but in private, he was a man broken down before middle age. There were countless other men whose names history never preserved who returned to farms, factories, and small towns after brief NFL careers, carrying with them headaches that never ended, depression that had no name, and bodies too fragile for manual labor. These men had given everything to a league that offered no pensions, no insurance, and no long-term care. For them, football's promise was glory on Saturday and Sunday, followed by silence and struggle for the rest of their lives. The ignorance wasn't only medical, it was cultural. Coaches didn't want to hear about lingering pain, and players didn't dare admit to it. To acknowledge weakness was to risk your paycheck in an era when jobs were scarce and mouths needed feeding. A lineman who confessed he was dizzy might be replaced by another desperate man willing to risk blindness or paralysis for a few dollars. The league thrived on this churn, always finding new bodies to feed the machine. The 1930s were also the decade when helmets began to appear more consistently. But they were little more than leather caps, thin shields, offering psychological comfort more than physical protection. Players still led with their heads, still collided at full force, and still walked away dazed. The leather helmet didn't stop the brain from rattling inside the skull, simply masked the reality, giving coaches an excuse to push men harder, to insist they were protected. What makes this chapter haunting isn't just the suffering, it's the silence that followed. There were no national conversations about safety, no union to advocate for reforms, no lawsuits demanding accountability. The men who broke down simply disappeared from the headlines, replaced by the next crop of rookies hungry for a chance. The system buried its victims under the weight of its own myth, that football was a game of men too tough to be broken. And yet, I think of those locker rooms, the stories players whispered only to each other. The running back who confessed to teammates that he sometimes woke up not remembering where he was. The lineman who admitted that his hands shook uncontrollably after certain hits. These confessions rarely left the locker room. They were bound by an unspoken code. You carried your pain in silence because that was the price of brotherhood. Looking back, it's easy to condemn the ignorance, to call it negligence. But the truth is, society itself wasn't ready to reckon with what the game was doing to its young men. In a decade defined by breadlines and dust storms, when families fought to keep food on the table, football offered something transcendent. It was escape. It was proof that the human body, pushed to its limits, could endure. To question its cost was to question a piece of American identity itself. But the men knew. Their bodies knew. The broken fingers that never straightened. The knees that gave out before age 40. It's the minds that grew cloudy long before old age. They bore it quietly, carrying the hidden ledger of football's debt, one injury at a time. And this is what makes the 1930s such a pivotal decade. It was only about the spectacle of violence or the rise of the league's popularity. It was about the foundation of a silence that would echo for generations. A silence that hid the truth of concussions, brain damage, and long-term disability for decades to come. The game was growing. Yes, but it was growing on the backs of men whose pain would never be acknowledged, whose sacrifices would never be fully recorded. In many ways, the 1930s wrote the script for the battles we still see today: players versus leagues, doctors versus culture, science versus tradition. Back then, the conversation was stifled before it could even begin. Players suffered in solitude, and the league marched forward. The silence of those years is deafening when you listen closely. Because the greatest tragedy of that decade I sent T simply the broken bones or the concussions. It's that no one believed the men when they said something was wrong. Their pain was invisible to the fans, ignored by the coaches, and minimized by the doctors. And so, the cycle continued. The story of the 1930s cannot be told without acknowledging this hidden ledger of suffering. It is as much a part of the decade's legacy as the touchdowns, championships, and legends we celebrate. The silence of those men lingers, a haunting reminder that progress in football has always been paid for in blood, bone, and silence. And in the next chapter, the story turns darker, still not just the physical wreckage, but the moral questions it raised. How far could a sport go in demanding loyalty from men it discarded when their usefulness ended? How long could it profit from suffering before society finally demanded a reckoning? The answers to those questions lay just ahead, in stories of betrayal, broken promises, and the first glimmers of a fight for dignity. Betrayal doesn't always announce itself with a violent hit or a broken bone. Sometimes it comes in ink and paper, in the cold wording of a contract, or in the silence of an owner who refuses to return a player's call. In the 1930s, betrayal was woven into the very structure of the National Football League. Players gave everything: body, health, even their lives to the game, and in return, they received contracts that evaporated the moment they were no longer useful. The economics of the Great Depression amplified this cruelty. Jobs were scarce, factories closed, men lined up in breadlines for hours just to put food on the table. For many, the NFL seemed like salvation, a paycheck, however small, and the chance to do what they loved. But that desperation gave owners unchecked leverage. If you complained about wages, they'd find another hungry man to take your spot. If you asked for your contract to be honored after an injury, they'd remind you that nothing in the paperwork guaranteed payment if you couldn't play. In the eyes of the league, you weren't an employee, you were an expendable asset. Players signed seasonal contracts, which often promised pay only if they appeared in games. There is no guaranteed money, no injury clauses, no pensions. A single bad hit could mean not just the end of your season, but the end of your livelihood. Stories circulated of men being released after breaking a bone. Their checks stopped immediately, leaving them to pay medical bills out of pocket. A fractured leg wasn't just a setback, it was financial ruin. One example that stands out comes from the Chicago Bears, a team that dominated the decade under George Halas. Halas was a brilliant organizer, a visionary who helped keep the league afloat. But he was also a ruthless businessman. If a player got hurt, Halas had no hesitation cutting him loose. Bronco Nagurski, one of the most iconic players of the era, admitted years later that even stars knew they were disposable. "You didn't argue," Nagurski once said. "If you couldn't play, someone else would." That was the way it was. His own career ended abruptly when mounting injuries left him unable to perform. Despite all he had done for the sport, there was no safety net waiting for him. For lesser-known players, the betrayal cut deeper. Linemen and journeyman men who never appeared in newspaper headlines often saw their contracts shredded the moment they limped off the field. A man could dedicate years to a team, fight through injury after injury, and still be discarded without a word of thanks. Fans celebrated the violence of the game, but they never saw the quiet betrayals that unfolded in locker rooms and offices. The exploitation extended beyond injuries. Pay itself was meager, even for stars. Average salaries in the early 1930s hovered around $100 a game, sometimes less. To put that in perspective, a factory worker might make similar money with less risk to life and limb. Players often had to take second jobs in the off-season, working as laborers, farmers, even policemen just to survive. Many rode freight trains or hitchhiked to training camp, unable to afford travel costs. Yet owners, though not wealthy by modern standards, often pocketed profits while refusing to invest in player welfare. Contracts were also written to favor teams in every way imaginable. Option clauses allowed owners to retain rights to a player for the following season without guaranteeing any raise in pay. A player who tried to jump to another team could be blacklisted. The lack of a union meant there was no collective bargaining, no one to fight back against these oppressive practices. In essence, players were indentured to their teams, bound by rules designed to keep them in line. The moral questions began to surface even then. Newspapers occasionally ran stories criticizing owners for mistreating injured men, but those voices were rare. Most fans didn't want to hear about the exploitation behind the scenes. They wanted the spectacle on Sunday. And so the cycle continued. Players sacrificed, owners profited, and the system protected itself with silence. The betrayal wasn't just financial. It was emotional. Men were told they were family, that they wore the jersey for something greater than themselves. Coaches preached loyalty, discipline, and sacrifice. Yet when their usefulness ended, the family vanished. The team doctor might pat you on the shoulder and wish you well, but your check stopped the moment you couldn't step on the field. The betrayal of brotherhood may have stung more than the loss of money. Some players tried to resist. In 1934, a group of men discussed forming an association to demand better treatment. They spoke about guaranteed pay and medical care, about pensions for men who left the game broken. But the effort never gained traction. Fear silenced them. Any man seen as a troublemaker risked being cut, blacklisted, or labeled not a team player. The seeds of a union were planted in the 1930s, but they wouldn't sprout until decades later. The consequences were devastating. Men retired with nothing, no savings, no health insurance, no support. Many ended up back in factories, mines, or farms, their bodies failing them at the very moment they needed them most. Stories emerged of former players living in poverty, forgotten by the very game they had helped build. The NFL of the 1930s was brutal, not only in its physical demands, but in its utter disregard for the humanity of the men who played. And yet, players kept coming. Why? Because for many, the alternative was worse. In an America scarred by the Depression, football was a chance at dignity, however fleeting. To wear an NFL uniform, even for a season, was to rise above the grinding poverty of daily life. Players endured betrayal because the dream, however fragile, still mattered. They wanted to be remembered, to etch their names into a history that too often erased them. When I look back on that decade, I don't just see the violence on the field. See the quiet betrayals off it. The broken promises. The contracts torn apart. The men left to fend for themselves while the league marched forward. Stronger, richer, more popular. The story of the 1930s isn't just about football survival. It's about how that survival was built on the backs of men who were discarded when they had nothing left to give. This is the dark truth of that decade. The NFL learned how to profit from sacrifice. It learned how to sell resilience while ignoring the cost, and it set a precedent that players would spend the next century fighting to undo. Because what is betrayal if not the theft of trust? These men trusted the game, trusted their teams, trusted that loyalty meant something. But in the 1930s, loyalty was a one-way street. And for too many, it ended not with glory, but with silence. And as the league grew, so too did the stakes. The betrayals of the 1930s paved the way for deeper conflicts ahead. The players would begin to demand more. Owners would fight harder to keep control. And the battle for dignity, already simmering beneath the surface, would soon erupt in ways no one could ignore. The 1930s were a decade of contradictions. On one hand, football was clawing its way into the American mainstream, finding new audiences, new heroes, and a permanent place in the nation's imagination. On the other, the very violence that made the game so compelling was also what threatened to destroy it. With each brutal collision, with every bloodied nose or broken bone, the public found itself asking a question that still lingers in every era of football. How much violence is too much? By the early 1930s, newspapers began to treat professional football with a seriousness once reserved only for college games. Headlines in cities like Chicago, New York, and Green Bay celebrated hard-fought victories and lionized stars like Bronco Nagurski and Don Hudson. Crowds swelled, sometimes drawing 20 or 30,000 people, astonishing numbers for a league that had been nearly invisible only a decade before. Yet alongside those glowing profiles were articles filled with outrage. Stories that described men being carried off the field unconscious, bones breaking in plain sight, and referees stopping games to allow blood to be wiped off the grass. Journalists played both sides of the story. They celebrated the spectacle while warning of its cost. In 1933, the New York Times ran a feature describing football as the most savage contest tolerated in America. Local papers across the Midwest often included injury reports almost as eagerly as they listed scores. Fans wanted violence, but they also feared it. They paid to see collisions that reminded them of warfare. Yet many went home uneasy after witnessing men limp away with shattered bodies. The 1930s also brought scandals that exposed just how dangerous the game had become. In 1931, a fatality in a semi-professional contest spilled into the headlines, sparking debates over whether football had crossed a line. Though the victim wasn't an NFL player, the tragedy was widely reported and cast a shadow over the sport. Critics demanded reforms, warning that unchecked violence would drive respectable society away. Even President Franklin D. Roosevelt, though more vocal later about the role of sports in American morale, was aware of the tension. Football inspired patriotism and unity, but it also raised fears of barbarism. Inside the league, owners understood this double-edged sword. They knew the violence sold tickets, crowds gasped at brutal hits, and newspapers covered the most violent games with relish. But they also knew too much blood on the grass could provoke politicians, journalists, and reformers to call for bans. Already, high school and college administrators were tightening rules to reduce fatalities. The NFL faced its own version of this reckoning. In 1933, the league introduced several rule changes aimed at making the game safer and more entertaining. Forward passing was expanded. Out-of-bounds plays were revised, and substitution rules were adjusted. On the surface, these changes looked like innovation, but they were also survival tactics. The NFL needed to reduce the sheer carnage on the field while maintaining the aura of toughness. The reforms were framed not as concessions to safety, but as improvements to strategy and excitement. That was the delicate balance of appeasing critics without alienating fans who craved violence. Still, violence remained central. Take the story of Iron Mike Michalski, a lineman for the Green Bay Packers in the early 30s. Sports writers celebrated him for his relentless style, the way he threw his entire body into every block. But behind the myth was a man who played through chronic injuries that left him barely able to walk after games. Reporters wrote of his heroism, while critics questioned whether glorifying such pain turned the sport into public cruelty. Mitch Halt's suffering was real, but it was framed as entertainment, a symbol of American grit during hard times. The public conversation mirrored the contradictions of the era. The Depression had stripped millions of stability and comfort, and football, violent, raw, unforgiving, felt like a reflection of that struggle. Families might have just enough money to attend one game a year, and what they wanted to see was survival against impossible odds. Violence wasn't just tolerated, it was demanded. It became a metaphor for resilience in the face of hardship. Yet, even as fans cheered, reformers asked whether society should indulge a sport that left so many young men permanently damaged. This tension came to a head in 1937, when medical researchers, already studying boxers with what they called punch-drunk syndrome, began drawing parallels to football. Though not yet widely circulated, some articles hinted that repeated blows to the head could lead to long-term cognitive decline. The press didn't know what to do with this information. Most sports writers ignored it, preferring to focus on touchdowns and rivalries. But a handful of journalists began whispering. Was football building its popularity on a foundation of human wreckage? Violence in football was also tied to identity. Fans in the 1930s didn't just see men colliding, they saw themselves. They saw factory workers, coal miners, and farmhands who had to endure punishing labor every day just to survive. The brutality of football seemed honest, even noble, compared to the quiet cruelty of economic despair. That cultural connection insulated the league from reform. Politicians might decry the bloodshed, but fans defended it. They argued that America needed tough men, and football forged toughness. The clash between popularity and outrage reached into homes across the country. Parents, particularly mothers, expressed fears about their sons playing. Newspapers often printed letters from concerned citizens questioning whether the game should be banned in schools. Yet fathers, coaches, and community leaders often countered that football built character, discipline, and unity. This generational divide mirrored the broader struggle between progress and tradition. For the NFL, the 1930s were about walking a tightrope. Push the violence too far, and the league risked public scandal, political interference, or worse, abolition. Scale it back too much, and the game might lose the very essence that drew fans in the first place. The league chose to straddle the line, introducing enough reforms to quiet critics while still promoting the image of football as the toughest game in America. And the paradox worked. By the end of the decade, the NFL had grown stronger than ever. Crowds were larger, stars were more recognizable, and the championship game had become a national event. The blood and broken bones were still there, but they were hidden beneath the myth of resilience. The outrage quieted, but it never disappeared. It lingered in the background, a warning that the sport's rise was fragile. That one tragedy too many could unravel everything. The 1930s left the NFL with a legacy of calculated brutality, a sport that marketed its violence while dressing it in the language of honor and perseverance. The league learned how to navigate outrage without reforming too much, how to give fans what they wanted without provoking the full force of critics. It was a dangerous balance, but it worked. And it set the stage for every future debate about football's violence, from concussions to player safety rules in the modern era. The truth is, the NFL of the 1930s needed violence to survive, even as it risked being destroyed by it. That contradiction, violence as both lifeblood and poison, became the central tension of professional football. And in the shadows of that tension, another betrayal was already taking shape: the league's quiet decision to exclude black players. A choice that revealed as much about the prejudices of the era as it did about the business of survival. When we talk about betrayal in the NFL's deadliest decade, nothing cuts deeper than the betrayal of race. The 1930s were not only a time of broken bodies and broken promises, they were also a time when an entire group of men was deliberately erased from the league. Football, which prided itself on being the toughest game in America, suddenly decided that some men were too dangerous, too threatening, simply because of the color of their skin. The story begins in the 1920s, when the NFL was still a fragile experiment. In those early years, a handful of black players found their way onto rosters. Fritz Pollard was the most famous San Electric halfback, and later the first black head coach in NFL history. Alongside him were men like Bobby Marshall, Duke Slater, and others who played in an era when professional football was desperate for talent, regardless of race. Their presence didn't mean the NFL was progressive. It simply meant survival mattered more than exclusion. But by the 1930s, when the league had stabilized, the calculus shifted. Survival no longer required inclusion, and so the door was slammed shut. In 1933, George Preston Marshall entered the league as owner of the Boston Braves, later renamed the Washington Redskins. Marshall was outspoken, flamboyant, and openly racist. He believed the NFL should mirror the segregated reality of American life, and he began pressing other owners to fall in line. Under his influence, and with the quiet agreement of men like George Halaz in Chicago and Tim Mara in New York, black players disappeared from rosters. By 1934, the NFL was all white. The the league would remain segregated for the next 13 years. This was not coincidence. It was not oversight. It was a deliberate decision, a color line drawn in silence, without official announcement, but with devastating clarity. Men like Joe Lillard, one of the last black players of the era, found themselves squeezed out. Lillard, a dynamic talent for the Chicago Cardinals in 1932 and 1933, was suddenly gone. He wasn't cut because of lack of skill. His ability was undeniable. He was cut because the league had decided there was no longer a place for him. His career ended not on the field, but in the backroom dealings of owners who valued racial conformity over fairness. The betrayal was profound because it wasn't just about football. It was about dignity. These men had proven they could compete at the highest level. They had endured the same pain, the same broken bones, the same brutal conditions as their white teammates. And still, when the league saw no further need for them, they were discarded. No pension, no recognition, not even the courtesy of honesty. They were simply erased from the record. Segregation in the NFL mirrored the broader currents of American society. The 1930s were years of Jim Crow laws, racial terror, and economic discrimination. In cities like Chicago and New York, black communities were confined to segregated neighborhoods, denied opportunities in employment, education, and housing. Football was no different. The game became another stage on which America acted out its prejudice. The NFL, in seeking legitimacy, chose to align itself with the nation's segregationist values rather than challenge them. It is worth remembering that this was not inevitable. College football in the North and West continued to feature black players throughout the 1930s. Stars like Kenny Washington, who played at UCLA, showed that integration was possible. Washington was one of the finest players of his generation, but when he graduated in 1939, no NFL team would draft him. He was left to play for semi-pro teams and in barnstorming circuits denied the stage his talent deserved. The hypocrisy was glaring. Fans and sports writers celebrated football as the ultimate meritocracy, a game where toughness and skill determined worth. Yet behind the scenes, merit mattered less than skin color. Black players who had already proven themselves were told they didn't belong. Their exclusion exposed the lie at the heart of the NFL's self-image. The league wasn't just about toughness or character, it was about protecting a segregated order. The betrayal extended beyond the players themselves. Black fans who had begun to follow the league found themselves pushed to the margins. They could cheer for college teams, for Negro League baseball, for boxing champions like Joe Louis. But in the NFL, their presence was unwelcome. Stadium seating was often segregated, and without black players to root for, many black fans turned away from the professional game altogether. The NFL's growth in the 1930s came at the cost of alienating an entire community. There's a haunting irony in this decision. At the very moment the league was fighting to survive the Depression, it chose to exclude some of the best athletes in America. Integration might have brought more talent, more fans, more legitimacy. Instead, the league narrowed its vision, reinforcing the prejudices of its owners and the society they reflected. The decision weakened the sport in ways that are still felt today. For the men who were shut out, the cost was personal and permanent. Fritz Pollard spent years lobbying for black players to return, only to be ignored. Joe Lillard drifted into obscurity. His career cut short, not by injury, but by injustice. Kenny Washington denied his chance in the 30s, would eventually break the color barrier in 1946. But by then, he had lost the prime of his career. These men carried the weight of exclusion not only in their bodies, but in their legacies. The NFL's segregation in the 1930s must be seen for what it was. One of the darkest betrayals in the history of the sport. It was a betrayal of the players who had earned their place. It was a betrayal of the fans who longed to see their communities represented. And it was a betrayal of the game itself, which pretended to be about merit, but bowed to prejudice instead. The 1930s shaped football in many ways through violence. Through survival, through reform, but its decision to exclude black players was perhaps its most defining and disgraceful act. It revealed that the league's pursuit of legitimacy came not through fairness or courage, but through conformity to a segregated America. And it left a scar on the game that would not begin to heal until after World War II. The silence of that era remains chilling. No owner admitted to the policy. No headline declared the league segregated. It simply happened, quietly, efficiently, with devastating effect. The players disappeared, the fans were pushed aside, and the league moved on. But the silence tells its own story. Sometimes betrayal doesn't need words. And as the 1930s gave way to the 1940s, the consequences of this exclusion grew clearer. The league had survived the Depression, but it had done so by narrowing its soul. It had chosen profit over principle, prejudice over progress. The betrayal of race stood alongside the violence and exploitation as one of the great moral failures of football's deadliest decade. But betrayal, as history teaches us, breeds resistance. In the shadows, men like Pollard, Washington, and others continued to fight. Their struggle would not be rewarded in the 1930s. But the seeds were planted. And those seeds would grow into the battles for integration and equality that reshaped the game in the decades to come. The 1930s taught us that football could survive brutality. But could it survive hypocrisy? That was the question waiting on the horizon. If the 1930s were a test of survival for the NFL as an institution, they were even more so for the men who strapped on leather helmets and called themselves professionals. To call yourself an NFL player in that decade was not to step into wealth or celebrity, was to step into a life of uncertainty, patched together with whatever scraps the world of sport could offer. In truth, most players weren't just athletes. They were hustlers, drifters, working-class men clawing their way through the wreckage of the Great Depression. We tend to imagine professional athletes as figures of glamour. But the NFL of the 1930s was closer to a traveling sideshow than a palace. Salaries were meager. A typical player could expect to earn between $50 and $100 a game. Some became teachers, laborers, salesmen. Others worked in steel mills, coal yards, or factories during the week, only to trade their coveralls for a uniform on Sunday. Stories abound of linemen showing up to practice with soot still on their hands, or halfbacks sprinting through plays on legs made heavy from 60-hour work weeks. The game demanded everything from them, but it gave little in return. Barnstorming was one of the only ways to make the sport pay. Teams and collections of players would travel from town to town, playing exhibitions against local squads or semi-pro outfits. These games were crude affairs, often staged on high school fields or makeshift patches of grass, but they paid cash under the table. A man could make more in one barnstorming weekend than he might in 3 official NFL games. But barnstorming carried risks. Injuries went untreated. The crowds were hostile, and sometimes the promoters vanished before paying out. Still, for players desperate to feed their families, it was worth the gamble. The Great Depression deepened this desperation. Jobs outside of football dried up. Factories laid off workers. Mines closed. Farms failed. And yet, the NFL kept grinding forward, demanding its players commit to brutal seasons for little more than pride. Many players quit outright, unwilling to sacrifice their bodies for such meager compensation. Those who stayed behind did so because football was in their blood or because there was nowhere else to go. Take Bronco Nagurski, the legendary fullback of the Chicago Bears. Nagurski was a farm boy from Minnesota. Built like a plow horse, and he became one of the most dominant forces the league had ever seen. But even Nagurski, the star of stars, had to think beyond football. During the off-seasons, he wrestled professionally, trading suplexes and headlocks in smoky arenas to earn money that football alone could not provide. His story was not unusual. Many NFL players wrestled, boxed, or took up vaudeville-style appearances just to keep cash flowing. For less famous men, the struggle was harsher. Linemen like George Musso or Mel Ungda, Ironmen of the trenches, endured endless pounding on Sundays. then spent Mondays hauling crates or manning factory lines. The NFL might have given them fleeting recognition, but it did not give them security. A single injury could end a career, and with it, the fragile income it provided. There were no guaranteed contracts, no health insurance, no pensions. If you broke a leg, you were finished. And when you were finished, the league forgot you. This precarious existence also left players vulnerable to exploitation. Owners held all the power. Men like George Halas could dictate salaries without negotiation. Knowing that players had no union, no leverage, and nowhere else to turn. If you wanted to play, you accepted what was offered. If you complained, you were gone. Some owners even threatened to blacklist players who pushed too hard for fair treatment, ensuring they would never work in football again. The imbalance of power was total. And yet, out of this landscape of desperation and exploitation, something extraordinary happened: innovation. Because players could not rely on money or stability, they relied on pride. They played for the love of the game, for the chance to prove themselves. For the roar of the crowd even, if that crowd numbered only a few hundred in a half-empty stadium. Pride became a form of currency, and pride demanded that the game evolve. This is where figures like Don Hutson entered the picture. Hutson was not a Depression survivor in the sense of manual labor, but he was a symbol of how football could reinvent itself in the hardest of times. In 1935, Hutson signed with the Green Bay Packers after a standout college career at Alabama. He was wiry, fast, and unlike anyone the league had seen. Up to that point, receivers had been afterthoughts. The passing game was still in its infancy. But Hutson changed everything. His speed and precise route running turned the forward pass into a weapon. And by the late 1930s, he was scoring touchdowns at a rate the league had never witnessed. Hutson's rise was a reminder that football, even in its darkest decade, was not static. The game adapted. Just as players found ways to survive off the field, the sport itself found ways to survive on it. Hutson gave fans something new to cheer for, something beyond the endless grind of line plunges and punishing collisions. He gave them artistry in a decade dominated by struggle. Still, Hutson was the exception, not the rule. For every Don Hutson, there were dozens of anonymous players who lasted a season or two, left with little more than bruises and regrets. Their names have been forgotten, their contributions lost to history, but their sacrifices were no less real. They were the men who filled rosters, who made the league possible, who endured the 1930s, not as stars, but as laborers in a brutal economy of sport. The Depression defined them. It taught them resilience, resourcefulness, and above all, toughness. To survive as an NFL player in the 1930s was to embody the very spirit the league later came to celebrate. The willingness to fight through pain, through poverty, through every obstacle. But the cost was enormous. Careers were short. Lives were shortened. Families bore the burden of broken bodies and unstable incomes. And when the cheering stopped, there was little left. Looking back, it's clear that the NFL of the 1930s was built not only on the violence of the field, but on the economic desperation of its players. These men were not pampered athletes. They were working-class survivors. They gave everything to a game that gave them almost nothing in return. And yet, without their sacrifice, the NFL would not have endured. The league survived the Depression because its players endured the Depression, shouldering its weight on their backs and in their bones. The paradox of the 1930s NFL is that its greatest weakness, the exploitation of its juicy players, was also its greatest strength. By forcing men to play for pride rather than money, the league created a culture of toughness and sacrifice that became its defining mythology. But mythology has a cost. And for the men of that decade, the cost was paid in broken bones, empty bank accounts, and forgotten names. The Depression left scars on football, just as it left scars on the nation. But it also left a legacy, a league that had proven it could survive the harshest of trials, carried on the backs of men who played not for wealth, but for survival. By the 1930s, professional football had clawed its way out of the shadows of semi-pro obscurity. But it was still a game in search of identity. A brutal contest where survival often outweighed strategy. What held the league together through its most fragile years was not just the resilience of players, but the vision of a handful of men who believed the game could be more than chaos. Men like George Halas of the Chicago Bears and Curly Lambeau of the Green Bay Packers. They weren't just coaches, they were architects, imposing order and system upon a sport that was threatening to collapse under its own violence. George Halas embodied the contradictions of early football. He was a businessman and a showman. But above all, he was a competitor. A former player himself, Halas carried into coaching the grit of the field. In the 1930s, he began to shape the Chicago Bears into a disciplined machine, introducing structures of training, play design, and organizational order that were nearly unheard of in the still primitive NFL. His philosophy was simple. Football had to evolve from sandlot improvisation into a craft that demanded precision. Halas demanded everything from his players. He expected them to treat football as a profession, even if the paychecks suggested otherwise. Practices under Halas were grueling. He drilled fundamentals, relentlessly blocking angles, tackling form, the timing of handoffs. To him, mistakes were unacceptable because mistakes cost games, and games cost the credibility of a league fighting for legitimacy. Halas knew that the NFL could not survive as a carnival sideshow. It had to be disciplined, it had to be professional, and it had to prove itself superior to college football, which still held the nation's heart. On the other side of Lake Michigan, Curly Lambeau was pursuing a similar mission. Lambeau had founded the Green Bay Packers back in 1919. But by the Depression years, he was much more than a founder. He was the heartbeat of a team that symbolized small-town resilience. Green Bay was a speck compared to Chicago, New York, or Philadelphia. Yet Lambeau transformed his club into a powerhouse. His genius was not just tactical, but cultural. He convinced a town devastated by economic hardship to rally around its football team as a source of pride and identity. Lambeau was also an innovator on the field, while Halas built his Bears around punishing ground games and suffocating defenses. Lambeau embraced the forward pass long before it was fashionable. He saw in the arm of Arnie, Herber, and later Cecil Isbell the potential to open the game, to bring aerial excitement to a sport too often bogged down in mud and muscle. With Don Hutson as his secret weapon, Lambeau created an offensive system that was ahead of its time. His Packers weren't just tough, they were inventive. Between them, Halas and Lambeau embodied two poles of football's emerging identity. Halas represented structure, discipline, and relentless toughness. Lambeau represented creativity, community, and vision. Both approaches mattered. Both approaches allowed the league to grow beyond its fragile state. What set these men apart was not only their tactical brilliance, but their sense of theater. They understood that football had to be more than a game. It had to be a spectacle. Halas orchestrated halftime shows, marching bands, and promotional gimmicks to draw in fans. Lambeau did the same in Green Bay, where community ownership of the team fostered a bond between the players and the town. The Depression had taken much from people. But football under Halas and Lambeau offered a few hours of escape, a shared ritual of hope and defiance. Other coaches began to follow their lead. Steve Owen of the New York Giants became known for defensive innovation, pioneering schemes to slow down passing attacks. Potsy Clark in Portsmouth and later Brooklyn contributed his own tactical flair. Each of these men brought a seriousness to the profession of coaching that had not existed a decade earlier. Where once teams were managed like barnstorming troops, now they were run with the discipline of military units. But the rise of coaching masterminds wasn't just about tactics or training, it was about legitimacy. Every time Halas's Bears executed a play with precision. Every time Lambeau's Packers thrilled with a passing strike. Every time Owen's Giants shut down an opponent with coordinated schemes, the league gained credibility. Fans could sense that the game was becoming more sophisticated, more purposeful. This was no longer a brutal freefall. It was a sport of intelligence and design. The 1930s also introduced the beginnings of playbooks, scouting, and film study. Hollis was one of the first to recognize the value of analyzing opponents systematically, not just relying on instinct. He compiled notes, diagrams, and observations, creating a foundation for the modern science of football preparation. His approach influenced generations of coaches to come, from George Allen to Mike Ditka. Yet this new professionalism came at a cost. For players, the demands of coaches like Hollis and Lambeau added another layer of burden to already punishing lives. It was not enough to survive the collisions on Sunday. Now they had to master complex systems, memorize assignments, and conform to the vision of their coaches. Mistakes were punished. Weakness was not tolerated. To play for Hollis or Lambeau was to live under constant scrutiny. But for many players, the discipline was worth it, because it gave them purpose in a world that offered little stability. The influence of these coaching masterminds extended beyond the field. They were also builders of institutions. Hollis fought tirelessly for league stability, pushing for standardized rules, better scheduling, and consistent officiating. Lambeau, by keeping the Packers alive in a town of barely 30,000 people, proved that professional football could take root in unexpected places. Together, they demonstrated that the NFL was not just a passing fad, but a sport capable of commanding loyalty and respect. It is no coincidence that both Hollis and Lambeau are enshrined as titans in the history of the game. They were not merely coaches, they were founders of a vision. Without them, the NFL might have drifted apart, consumed by financial chaos, violence, and indifference. With them, the league found a path forward: discipline on one side, innovation on the other. Theater binding them both. As the 1930s wore on, the fingerprints of these men could be seen everywhere. The Bears became the league's powerhouse, culminating in the famous 73-0 demolition of Washington in the 1940 NFL Championship. A victory born of Hollis's organizational genius. The Packers became champions multiple times in the decade, riding the creativity of Lambeau's passing game. And across the league, other coaches adapted, refined, and added their own layers. The sport was evolving rapidly, pulled upward by men who refused to let it stagnate. The rise of coaching masterminds in the 1930s revealed something essential about football's future. It could not survive on toughness alone. It needed structure. It needed vision. It needed leaders who could impose meaning on chaos. And in men like Hollis and Lambeau, the game found its guiding lights. But even as coaching brought order, another force was reshaping the NFL. The spectacle of the stadium. Football was no longer confined to small-town fields and ragged crowds. It was beginning to unfold in grander arenas, with pageantry and performance designed to capture the imagination of fans. The rise of the coaching masterminds had given football its structure, but the rise of stadium culture would give it its soul. By the middle of the 1930s, the National Football League had survived long enough to begin imagining something bigger for itself. It was no longer just about the survival of teams or the grit of players. It was about the atmosphere. The stage, the sense of spectacle that turned a brutal game into a communal ritual. Football in the 1930s became more than a sport. It became an event, one woven deeply into the lives of towns, cities, and entire regions struggling to find joy in the midst of economic despair. Stadiums were the crucibles of this transformation. They were not yet the gleaming cathedrals of modern football, but they were gathering places of identity, pride, and release. In Green Bay, City Stadium was modest, little more than a few wooden bleachers nestled against a high school. But for the people of Green Bay, it was hallowed ground. In that small town, with its shuttered factories and uncertain future, Sunday football became a civic ritual. The stadium was not just where games were played, it was where hope was renewed, where neighbors huddled together in the biting Wisconsin cold to watch their Packers defy the odds against far richer, bigger market teams. Chicago, by contrast, offered scale and ambition. Wrigley Field, better known as a baseball park, became the Bears' home turf. It was here that George Halas brought his vision of professional football as theater. Halas understood that fans needed not only the grit of the game, but also the pageantry around it. He arranged marching bands, halftime shows, and parades. He made sure the Bears contests felt like occasions, something worth braving the Depression's daily hardships to attend. The Bears drew crowds in the tens of thousands, and each roar of approval confirmed that the NFL was not merely surviving, it was embedding itself in American culture. New York brought yet another layer. The Giants played at the Polo Grounds, and later Yankee Stadium, tying professional football to the beating heart of the nation's largest city. The Giants were more than a team. They were a statement that the NFL could claim legitimacy in the shadow of Broadway, Wall Street, and Madison Avenue. When fans poured into those cavernous stadiums, they weren't just watching football, they were participating in a new kind of civic performance, one that linked their identities to the triumphs and failures of a team wearing their city's name. Bands and pageantry played a crucial role. College football had long been known for its marching bands and school songs, and the NFL, desperate to capture some of that collegiate glamour, borrowed freely. Trumpets blared, drums thundered, and cheerleaders led chants that turned stadiums into theaters of sound and movement. Fans came not only for the game, but for the shared experience, the feeling of belonging to something larger than themselves. In an era when unemployment lines stretched down city blocks and despair loomed in every household, football gave people a chance to celebrate together, if only for a few hours. These rituals took on symbolic weight. In Green Bay, the sound of a brass band marching down the street before a Packers game was a declaration that the town still had pride. In Chicago, the crowd's chant of "Da Bears" became a badge of resilience for working-class immigrants packed into the city's neighborhoods. In New York, a Giants victory meant the city's restless energy had found another outlet for expression. Each game was more than competition, it was a mirror of community identity. The stadium itself became a symbol of defiance. When people had little money, they still found ways to scrape together the price of a ticket. Men skipped meals, families saved nickels. Teenagers worked odd jobs not because they had extra cash to spend, but because attending a football game meant they were part of something unbroken, something alive. The act of showing up to a stadium in the middle of the Great Depression was itself an act of resilience. Attendance figures reveal the growing spectacle. In 1935, the NFL drew just over 600,000 total fans for the season. By the end of the decade, that number had nearly doubled, pushing toward 1.2 million. It was still small compared to baseball, the undisputed national pastime, but the growth mattered. Each person in those stands represented not just a paying customer, but a believer in the game's future. Each ticket sold was proof that football had found a foothold in the American imagination. The ritual of fandom also began to evolve in the 1930s. Families passed down loyalty to teams. Fathers brought sons to games, teaching them the chants, pointing out players by name, weaving football into the generational fabric of identity. Newspapers ran columns not only about the contests, but about the fans, the bands, the atmosphere. The press began to frame football not just as a sport, but as a cultural event, a Sunday ritual alongside church, dinner, and community gatherings. In this way, stadium culture bound people together. Fans who might otherwise be divided by class, neighborhood, or ethnicity found themselves united by the fortunes of their team. The leather-helmeted men on the field were not distant celebrities. They were heroes of the community, extensions of the people in the stands. A victory lifted spirits. A loss was felt collectively. In a nation struggling with isolation and despair, football created temporary unity, something larger than the sum of its parts. It is important to understand that the spectacle of the 1930s NFL was fragile, built on borrowed traditions and improvised showmanship. There were no billion-dollar television contracts, no corporate sponsorships. Everything rested on the willingness of fans to gather, to cheer, to create atmosphere with their own voices and energy. The league's survival depended on these rituals. Without fans, the NFL would have vanished into history, another Depression-era casualty. But with them, it endured. Looking back, the rise of stadium culture in the 1930s reveals something profound about the sport. Football was never just about the collisions, the touchdowns, or the trophies. It was about belonging. It was about communities battered by economic collapse finding reason to gather, reason to cheer, reason to believe. The stadium became a sacred space where ordinary people could leave behind the weight of the Depression and step into a shared story of struggle and triumph. By the end of the decade, the NFL had something it had lacked in its early years: roots. Those roots were not in boardrooms or bank accounts. They were in stadiums filled with people who sang, shouted, and believed. They were in the rituals of bands, the rhythm of chants, the collective roar that rolled across a field when a touchdown was scored. Football was no longer a game for a handful of players scraping by. It was a spectacle that belonged to the people. The decade proved that the NFL could survive not only through grit and violence, but through community and culture. And it was that culture, those fans, those stadiums, those Sunday rituals that would carry the league into the future. But as the 1930s drew to a close, another storm loomed on the horizon. One that would test football in ways even harsher than the Depression. The world was inching toward war, and with it, the NFL would face questions of survival on a global scale. The year was 1939. America was still clawing its way out of the Great Depression, and the storm clouds of war were already breaking across Europe. On the front pages of newspapers, headlines spoke of German tanks rolling into Poland and Britain, preparing for another fight to the death. But tucked away in the sports sections, another story was unfolding, a quieter story, but one that was shaping the soul of American culture. On Saturdays, college campuses came alive with marching bands and rivalries. On Sundays, professional football had begun to command its own loyal audience. The NFL, still modest compared to baseball, had survived a decade of near extinction. And by the end of the 1930s, it was no longer a traveling carnival, it was a permanent institution. For the first time, professional football felt less like an experiment and more like a tradition in the making. Crowds gathered at Wrigley Field in Chicago, Griffith Stadium in Washington, and the Polo Grounds in New York. Not merely for distraction, but for belonging. The NFL had carved out its space in American life, even as a new decade and a new war threatened to sweep everything away. But before that storm arrived, the late 1930s brought a final wave of change, a set of evolutions that would alter the way the game was played forever. The first and most obvious transformation was the rise of the forward pass. For years, the passing game had been treated as an act of desperation, a trick play, rather than a foundational strategy. Coaches distrusted it. Players weren't trained for it. Fans barely expected it. But slowly, the tide turned. At the center of this revolution was a young man from Temple, Texas, Sammy Baugh, known simply as Slinging Sammy. Drafted by the Washington Redskins in 1937, Baugh didn't just throw passes. He redefined what was possible. His sidearm motion sent the ball slicing through defenses that had never been designed to stop aerial attacks. That season, his rookie season, he led Washington to a championship, and suddenly the forward pass was no longer an afterthought. It was a weapon. Baugh's presence on the field felt like a rupture in football history. His accuracy, his confidence, his ability to turn third and long into an opportunity rather than a death sentence, these qualities forced coaches to rethink entire playbooks. While most teams still clung to the grind it out, 3 yards and duck low dove-est philosophy, Baugh showed that the future could be built in the air. And yet, his emergence also highlighted the chasm between old football and new football. The Chicago Bears, still a powerhouse, relied on punishing ground games and relentless defense. The Packers, under Curly Lambeau, balanced rushing attacks with precise, short passes, while Washington let Baugh spread the field. The sport itself seemed to straddle two arrows, one foot planted in the mud-soaked trenches of the 1920s, the other reaching toward the modern spectacle it would become. Another critical shift came in the rules of substitution. Early in the decade, players were expected to perform on both sides of the ball. You ran the ball on offense. Then you turned around and tackled on defense. Fatigue was part of the challenge. Versatility was a necessity. But by the late 1930s, the league began loosening restrictions, allowing coaches to substitute players more freely. The effect was subtle at first, but profound in the long run. Specialists began to emerge. A player might be valued for his ability to punt, or for his defensive acumen, or for his accuracy as a passer. Teams began building rosters not simply of Ironman athletes, but of strategic tools. The seeds of modern football. The idea of an offensive unit and a defensive unit, each with its own skill set, were planted in these late Depression years. Scouting, too, grew more sophisticated. College football remained the proving ground, and NFL owners sent scouts across the Midwest, the South, and the East to find the next crop of stars. No longer was the draft a casual affair or a gentleman's agreement. By the close of the 1930s, it was becoming the backbone of league survival. The decade also closed with the rise of strategy as spectacle. Coaches like George Halas and Curly Lambeau were no longer simply motivators. They were architects, designing plays that required precision timing and coordinated deception. The 1930s had introduced the T formation, but it was in these final years that its potential began to crystallize. With quarterbacks like Baugh showing what the pass could achieve, systems began to bend around this new possibility. Fans noticed. Football, once a brute's game, was becoming something more cerebral, still violent, still unforgiving, but layered with tactics. Newspapers praised gridiron generals and master strategists. The public began to recognize that what unfolded on Sunday afternoons was not merely a test of brawn, but a clash of minds. All of this innovation existed against a backdrop of uncertainty. As Americans filed into stadiums in the autumn of 1939, they carried newspapers that spoke of war raging overseas. They read about Hitler's armies sweeping through Europe with something called blitzkrieg, lightning war, mechanized and terrifying. At the very same time, football reporters in the States were borrowing that language to describe defensive rushes and offensive countermeasures. Blitzes, they called them. The word itself was imported from conflict, reimagined for the gridiron. The parallels weren't lost on anyone. On one page, reports of bombers over Warsaw. On the next, accounts of the Packers battling the Giants in the snow. Football became an escape, a way to keep life normal, even as the world tilted. But beneath the cheers and the spectacle, there was an undercurrent of unease. Everyone knew that America would not stay out of the war forever. For the NFL, the question was simple. Had it come far enough to survive? What was coming next? By 1939, the league had stabilized franchises, captured a loyal following, and begun to produce stars whose names echoed beyond their home cities. But the rosters were made up of young men, the very demographic most likely to be called away should America enter the fight. Stadiums could fall silent overnight. Teams could be gutted by the draft board instead of the NFL draft. The decade closed with contrasts so sharp they felt almost surreal. In Chicago, the Bears were perfecting the T formation with a young backfield that would soon change football forever. In Washington, Sammy Baugh was redefining what it meant to be a quarterback. In Green Bay, Curly Lambeau still clung to the balance of power, football, and precision passing that had kept his Packers competitive for a generation. Across the league, coaches were scribbling diagrams, experimenting, imagining what else the game could be. And yet, across the Atlantic, another kind of diagram was unfolding: battle plans, invasion routes, mobilization, timetables. The NFL had just secured its identity, just found its footing as more than a curiosity. Now it would be tested again, not by economics or rule changes, but by the largest war the world had ever known. The 1930s had begun with doubt, with whispers that professional football might not survive at all. They ended with momentum, innovation, and promise. But history has a way of striking at moments of triumph. The NFL had finally proven itself essential to the fabric of American sport to face a challenge that could unravel it all. The war was coming, and football, like everything else, would not escape untouched. The war did not arrive with a sudden jolt. It crept closer in headlines and radio broadcasts, in the unease of conversations held in barbershops and corner diners. By the time the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the United States had already felt the tremors of a global conflict. But in that single day, the tremors became an earthquake. America was at war, and everything sports included would be reshaped by the demands of survival. For the National Football League, the 1930s had been about proving legitimacy. The question of the 1940s was simpler but more existential. Could the league endure it all while the nation sent its young men overseas? Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, NFL rosters began to thin. Draft boards pulled players out of uniforms stitched with team logos and placed them into uniforms sewn with military insignia. The transformation was staggering. By 1942, more than 600 NFL players and coaches had either enlisted or been drafted. Entire rosters collapsed under the weight of wartime necessity. The Chicago Bears lost their legendary quarterback, Sid Luckman, for stretches. The Cleveland Rams saw their talent pool nearly evaporate. The Philadelphia Eagles bled players into the Army, the Navy, the Marines. Some stars went directly into combat. Jack Lummis, an end for the New York Giants, traded his cleats for Marine boots. In 1945, at Iwo Jima, he led an assault under heavy fire, clearing enemy positions before being struck by 2 landmines. Mortally wounded, he received the Medal of Honor posthumously. Stories like his blurred the line between Sunday heroics and battlefield valor. Others contributed stateside. Players became physical training instructors, teaching recruits how to march, how to endure, how to throw a punch. The same discipline they had honed on the gridiron was repurposed to forge soldiers. The league faced a logistical crisis. With rosters stripped bare, how could games even be played? The answer came in the form of creativity and compromise. The 1943 season produced one of the strangest chapters in NFL history. The Steagles, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh, both decimated by the draft, merged into a single franchise for 1 year. The Steagles wore green and white jerseys in some games, black and gold in others, depending on which city hosted. They practiced in makeshift facilities, traveling between 2 towns that shared nothing but desperation. The roster was a patchwork of young players too old for the draft. Men with medical exemptions and part-time athletes juggling factory jobs alongside football careers. The Steagles finished 5-1, a winning record in a season that should have been impossible. But the point wasn't victories or losses. It was survival. The mere act of playing games, of filling stadiums, and giving Americans a few hours of escape was itself a triumph. The following year, Pittsburgh merged again, this time with the Chicago Cardinals. They were known, with cruel humor, as the Carpets. Unlike the Steagles, the Carpets were a disaster. They went winless, overmatched at every turn. Still, their existence was proof that the NFL would not fold. The war years were lean in quality but rich in symbolism. Fans understood that the men on the field were not the best football had to offer. The best were overseas. Yet, precisely because of that, the games mattered. On cold Sundays, with rationing dictating daily life and casualty reports arriving in morning papers, football offered continuity. A reminder that not all traditions had been sacrificed. Teams adapted in unusual ways. Rosters included players well into their 30s. Men who otherwise would have retired, but whose experience kept the sport afloat. Coaches scoured small colleges for talent, searching for anyone who could block, tackle, or catch a pass. Medical exemptions gave chances to players with bad knees or minor conditions. men who might never have cracked a roster in peacetime. Some games were played in half-empty stadiums because wartime travel restrictions limited attendance. Others sold out as fans clung to rare moments of normalcy. Newspapers carried accounts of soldiers listening to games on shortwave radios, hearing scores relayed across oceans. For them, football wasn't just sport. It was America itself, condensed into quarters and hash marks. But the war also carried tragedy for the league. Al Blozis, a tackle for the New York Giants, stood 6'6", 250 pounds, a giant even by today's standards. Drafted in 1942, he played part of the 1943 season before the Army called him to duty. In January 1945, in the Vosges Mountains of France, Blozis went searching for missing members of his platoon. He never returned. At just 26 years old, he was killed in action. His story reverberated through the NFL, a reminder that even its largest figures were vulnerable to history's cruelest battles. The league honored him and others like him. Not with elaborate ceremonies, but with silence, with moments of reflection before kickoff. The war humbled football, shrinking it down to its essence. It was no longer about building dynasties or chasing records. It was about resilience. And yet, the war accelerated football's transformation in ways few anticipated. Military service introduced thousands of young men to the game. Training camps used football drills to build teamwork and toughness. Soldiers who had never played organized sports learned to tackle, to run, to block. When they came home, many carried that knowledge with them, fueling interest in the sport beyond traditional strongholds. Even strategy was shaped by war. The discipline of formations, the language of blitzes and flanking maneuvers, the emphasis on precision all echoed the culture of the military. Football borrowed not only words but entire mental frameworks from the battlefield. Coaches began to describe playbooks in terms of campaigns, drives in terms of advances, defenses in terms of fortresses to be broken. By the final year of the war, the NFL was battered but unbroken. Attendance dipped, rosters thinned, franchises merged and unmerged. But the league had not folded, as some predicted it would. Baseball had remained America's pastime, but football, against the odds, had proven it could survive not just depression but global conflict. The return of peace would bring its own revolution. Soldiers came home with new confidence, new hunger, and new ideas of what sport could mean. They wanted speed, spectacle, and heroes who mirrored their own sacrifices. The NFL, entering the late 1940s, was poised to meet that demand. The war had nearly undone the league. But in its survival, football earned something priceless: permanence. It was no longer fragile, no longer a curiosity that might disappear. It had endured depression, brutality, and now war. That endurance would become its defining story. The 1930s had shaped football's structure. The 1940s had tested its very existence. What came next was not survival, but ascendance. By the close of the 1930s, the NFL had been tempered by fire. What began as a fragile experiment in towns like Portsmouth, Green Bay, and Dayton had endured 10 of the most punishing years in the history of American sport. The league emerged battered, scarred, but unmistakably alive. It was a strange kind of survival. Teams had folded, others had merged. Great players had been broken by injuries so severe that their names now appear in medical journals more often than in record books. Yet, through that chaos, the NFL had achieved something priceless: permanence. By the time America turned the corner into the 1940s, professional football was no longer a novelty. It was no longer just a Sunday diversion. It had become an institution, one that ordinary people could not imagine life without. The 1930s were a decade of contradictions. They were deadly, violent, and unforgiving. Players walked onto fields without the certainty they would walk off again. Deaths in college and professional football climbed into the dozens, and newspapers carried headlines about paralysis, shattered spines, and broken skulls. At the same time, the game evolved. the forward pass finally broke through the stubborn defenses of tradition. The 1932 Indoor Championship reshaped the rules and birthed the playoff system. Bronco Nagurski carried the mythology of raw strength, while Sammy Baugh hinted at a future defined by air, not ground. In its brutality and in its breakthroughs, the 1930s defined what football would become. For the players, it was never about fame. Fame was fleeting, and in those days, it often vanished as quickly as the roar of the crowd. It was about survival. Financial survival, physical survival, emotional survival. Men played through shattered ribs, dislocated shoulders, and concussions that left them staggering. They played not because they loved pain, but because the paycheck meant food on the table during a depression that offered few other paths. In doing so, they created a culture that remains with us today. The ethos of playing through it, the mythology of toughness. The expectation that an NFL player must endure more than the ordinary man. All of that was born in the mud and blood of the 1930s. The decade also exposed football's darkest truths. The exclusion of black athletes from the league in 1933 revealed a cowardice that clashed with the mythology of courage. The NFL, desperate to survive financially, bowed to prejudice and shut out men who could have elevated the game further. It would take another decade before reintegration even began, and the stain of that decision lingers in the historical record. Meanwhile, corruption lurked in the shadows. Gambling whispers followed certain games. Owners cut corners on player contracts, offered meager medical care, and prioritized profit over protection. The sport's survival came at the cost of exploitation, a fact as chilling today as it was invisible then. And yet, despite its sins, the NFL grew. Why? Because the 1930s gave football something that baseball and boxing, for all their grandeur, could not replicate: a reflection of struggle itself. In the Depression, Americans endured hunger, joblessness, and uncertainty. They watched men fight for scraps of dignity, clawing for every inch of stability. On Sunday afternoons, they saw the same mirrored on the field, a violent contest of will, where victory was less about talent and more about survival. The NFL resonated not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Its violence was not sanitized, its players not romanticized. It was brutal, unforgiving, and honest. It was America, distilled into 4 quarters. By 1939, when the first NFL game was broadcast on television, the league had stepped into the future. Fans sitting in living rooms could now see the sweat, the collisions, the agony, and the triumph in real time. Football was no longer confined to stadiums or newspaper columns. It had entered the national consciousness in a new way, just as the country itself stood on the edge of global conflict. That timing mattered. As America marched toward war, football had already proven it could endure hardship. When young men shipped out overseas, they carried with them not just memories of home, but memories of Sunday afternoons spent cheering for teams that represented resilience itself. Looking back, the 1930s were not simply the NFL's deadliest decade. They were its crucible. Every brutal tackle, every fractured bone, every folded franchise was a blow of the hammer. Every innovation, every new rule, every courageous player who pushed the boundaries of the possible was a spark from the fire. Out of that relentless beating, something unbreakable took shape. The NFL that entered the 1940s was not yet the colossus we know today, but it was no longer fragile. It was no longer a curiosity. It had roots deep enough to weather storms, a structure strong enough to evolve, and a mythology powerful enough to capture the American imagination. For us, in the present, it is easy to see the NFL as inevitable, as though it was always destined to become the most dominant sports league in the world. But the truth is far darker, far more complicated. The NFL was not destined to survive. It clawed its way through the 1930s with desperation in its eyes and blood on its hands. Men sacrificed their health, their futures, even their lives to keep the league afloat. Fans paid dimes to sit on wooden bleachers, shouting for teams that might not exist the following season. Owners gambled on hope as much as on profit. Nothing was guaranteed. And yet, through it all, the game endured. When we watch football today, when we marvel at the speed, the strategy, the spectacle, we are witnessing the inheritance of that brutal decade. Every touchdown, every Sunday night under the lights, every Super Bowl spectacle is built on the bones of men who played in mud without face masks, who worked second jobs to feed their families, who faced a world collapsing in depression and still found the courage to step onto a field. The 1930s were the NFL's deadliest decade, but they were also its defining decade. Out of death came identity. Out of desperation came permanence. Out of survival came dominance. The NFL would never be the same again, and neither would America.
The decade we have walked through together, the 1930s, was not glamorous. It was not gilded with million-dollar contracts or polished by the careful management of public image. It was raw, unforgiving, and often cruel. Yet, it is impossible to tell the story of the modern NFL without first reckoning with the darkness that gave it shape. The 1930s were football's proving ground, and they proved everything the sport has carried forward into the present. Its endurance, its mythology, its contradictions, and its power to reflect America back to itself. When we look at the NFL today, billion-dollar stadiums, gleaming under lights, global audiences tuning in to the Super Bowl players whose names are etched not just in record books, but in cultural memory, it is tempting to see inevitability. To imagine the sport was always destined for greatness. But inevitability is an illusion. In truth, the NFL of the 1930s stood on the edge of collapse almost every season. Teams folded, merged, and vanished. Players risked their lives for wages that barely kept food on the table. Fans paid nickels to watch games played in freezing mud. The league was fragile, teetering between obscurity and irrelevance. Its survival was not assured. It was earned through the sacrifices of men who played on shattered bones, through the loyalty of fans who believed in the spectacle, through the stubbornness of owners who gambled on hope more than profit. What makes the 1930s essential is that it revealed the paradox at the heart of football. The sport is both brutal and beautiful, destructive and unifying, exploitative and inspiring. Those contradictions did not emerge later. They were there from the beginning. Consider the players. They were both gladiators and victims, celebrated for their toughness while exploited for their labor. They gave everything they had, knowing that their bodies would never fully recover, and often walked away with nothing more than scars and memories. And yet, their sacrifice elevated the game, embedding it with a mythology of toughness that still defines football culture today. Consider the owners. They cut costs, cut corners, and at times failed in their duty to protect players. Yet, without their stubborn persistence, the league itself might have vanished. Their short-term decisions were often ruthless, but their long-term gamble kept professional football alive. Consider the fans. They watched with both awe and unease, drawn to the spectacle but unsettled by the danger. And in their cheers, in their willingness to show up week after week, they gave football the one thing it needed most: legitimacy. The The 1930s also revealed football's entanglement with American identity. It was no coincidence that the sport found its footing during the Great Depression. In a nation defined by hardship, football mirrored the struggle. It was not graceful like baseball, not glamorous like boxing. It was gritty. It was survival. Every yard gained was an act of defiance against despair. Every victory was proof that perseverance mattered. Football resonated because it captured what it meant to be American in the 1930s. To endure when endurance seemed impossible to fight, when the odds said you had no chance to keep pushing forward even when the field was nothing but mud. And that connection has never disappeared. The NFL, for all its evolution, still sells itself as a story of resilience. Its greatest legends, from Bronco Nagurski to Tom Brady, are framed not merely as athletes, but as symbols of endurance, grit, and sacrifice. That cultural through line begins in the 1930s. But to honor that decade, we must also confront its shadows. The exclusion of black athletes after 1933 stands as one of the most shameful decisions in the league's history. In a decade when the sport desperately needed the best talent available, it chose prejudice over progress. That choice limited the game's potential and reflected the nation's wider contradictions. A country that celebrated perseverance while denying opportunity to many of its own citizens. The exploitation of players is another shadow. Medical care was minimal, safety standards were non-existent, concussions, broken spines, and lifelong injuries were treated as occupational hazards rather than crises. The NFL built its foundation on those sacrifices, and even now, echoes of that exploitation remain in debates over player health and safety. These truths complicate the mythology. They remind us that football's rise was not only a triumph of will, but also a story of costs, some of which were borne unfairly. And yet, in reflecting on those costs, one cannot help but see the weight of what the 1930s gave the NFL. Out of violence came innovation. Out of instability came structure. Out of desperation came a permanent place in the American story. The 1932 Indoor Championship rewrote the rules and created the playoff system, without which modern football could not exist. The rise of players like Bronco Nagurski and Sammy Baugh expanded what the game could be. Nagurski embodying its primal force, Baugh heralding its strategic elegance. The struggles of franchises forced the league to stabilize, laying groundwork for future expansion. The decade's brutality compelled eventual safety reforms, imperfect though they were. In short, the NFL that emerged from the 1930s was not the NFL that had entered it. It was leaner, tougher, more coherent, and most importantly, undeniable. Looking back from today, the 1930s almost feel mythic. The grainy photographs, the leather helmets, the muddy fields, they create an aura of distance, as though we are peering into another world. But the truth is more immediate. The DNA of the modern NFL runs straight through that decade. Every Sunday, when millions of fans gather in living rooms or stadiums, they are participating in a ritual born in those harsh years. Every quarterback dropping back to throw a pass owes something to the breakthroughs of the late 1930s. Every playoff run traces back to that fateful 1932 game in Chicago. Every roar of the crowd carries echoes of the ones that rose in Depression-era stands, when people who had lost so much still found hope in a sport that mirrored their struggle. The 1930s were football's deadliest decade, but death was not the end of the story. In the paradox of American sport, it was death, or the constant risk of it, that gave football life. The game's fragility made it precious. Its brutality made it unforgettable. Its survival made it eternal. So when we ask how the NFL became the most powerful sports league in the world, the answer does not lie in television deals or billion-dollar stadiums. It lies in the mud of the 1930s, in the broken bones and scarred bodies of men who refused to quit, in the resilience of fans who refuse to look away. The 1930s did not simply shape the sport. They defined it. They gave football its soul, a soul forged in pain, in endurance, in defiance. And that is the haunting legacy of the NFL's deadliest decade, that out of its darkest struggle, America's greatest game was born.